really happy to be able to introduce our good friend Darin Johnstone today. Some of you might not know him as well as most of us do, so I'll hit on some biographical data, if you bear with me. Darin got his Bachelor of Architecture at Cal Poly Pomona, followed that up at Columbia in the mid-90s with his master's degree. He then, during that time and after, was through the offices of Frank Gehry, Bernard Tschumi, Coop Himmelblau, and extended time at Holt Hinshaw. Darin started his own office in 1999 as principal of Johnstone Parker, and then since 2004 has been Darin Johnstone Architects. Darin's taught here at SciArc since 2002, and he's been, wow, you're in graduate, undergrad, I think you've taught every undergraduate studio there is, and half the graduate at least. You've been on pretty much every committee there is to be on SciArc. And now he's taking on this summer the DID program, as in DID SciArc Design Immersion Days for high school students that we're starting this summer. And he's been active setting up that whole program, and he'll be leading it this summer, parallel and separate from Making and Meeting. You know, as I said, these lunchtime lectures are a good way to see what each of us have been up to outside the school. And while we'd probably all agree that the strength of SciArc lies in its diversity of viewpoints and positions, it's also a place where we all find somewhat a safe haven from the world outside, which can be somewhat unreceptive and hostile to our architectural endeavors. And now I'm speaking of the practice of architecture. And in this light, I see these lectures as a time when we get to hear each other kind of report back, like a reconnaissance mission, like, what's going on out there? Some come back and say, it's hell out there, brother. And others say, it's not so bad. It's looking pretty good. Is it? Is it? And we all kind of look at each other, you know, in the hallways, whether we're talking about Wiscombe in China, or you here, or various things we're doing. And this is the kind of maybe therapeutic aspect of us meeting each other in the halls. This is a little bit more formal one where we get to really hear, in this case, maybe 10 years of a guy who's been doing some interesting work. I have an ex-SciArc student in my office who's a recent grad, and I said, yeah, I'm going to introduce this guy Darin. You know him? Yeah, I had him, he said. Yeah, he was in my studio. He said, he's the nicest guy at SciArc. I said, you know what? I said, you're right. He is the nicest guy at SciArc, in the best sense, in that he has a wonderful demeanor and a wonderful way of delivering criticism, I find. But I think it'd be a mistake to misread Darin's niceness, because I believe there's something else underneath there. There's something playful and devious behind the infectious smile and calming voice. It reminds me of something Peter Cook said to me recently. He said, you know, sometimes the most interesting people in the room are the quiet sorts, his words, the ones you least suspect. I think that's the case with Darin today. He recently told me that his sons are fascinated by robots, and he hasn't told them yet that SciArc's getting robots because he knows they'll hound him and beg them to come here, and they'll play with them and maybe break them, in which case he'll get in trouble. And it reminded me of when I met your sons once over at the house, and as you know, I have a daughter. And your oldest son, when we introduced the kids, he said, hey, here's Maeve, here's her. And I remember he had like a little piece of grass on the side of his mouth, and he had a hat on. And he was crossed like this. He looked like kind of like Clint Eastwood. And he looked at my daughter, and he said, nice to meet you, and he tipped his hat. So I guess what I want to say is, we've got to watch these Johnstone boys. We've got to watch all four of them. And we're going to watch him now. Let's please welcome Darin Johnstone.
That was fantastic. That was a really nice introduction. Thank you, John. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've been up to since I've been teaching here at SciArc. But mostly I'm going to talk about what I've been up to outside the realm of this particular building, which is sometimes exciting or exhilarating and sometimes difficult, obviously. So John's right. I mean, it's really an opportunity to kind of do a little bit of reconnaissance. So I'll explain more about the title as we get into the talk, but it's as obvious as it seems. So. The first thing that I wanted to do is do a little bit of a kind of disclosure, which is to say that this is kind of a warts and all, or a kind of a pimples and all lecture, let's say. So this is my high school annual from 1984, and so that handsome devil right there with the feathered hair and the Le Tigre shirt, that's me, right? So what I want to say is that I'm not so interested in going back and tuning up the work that I did, or in changing the way that it looks, or re-rendering it, or redrawing it. The work happened when it happened, and I'm going to show it in that way, in a kind of warts and all or pimples and all way, and not try and restyle it. Although I will say that looking at this photograph, it made me realize that maybe some of my kind of stylistic tendencies are coming back again. I think I've been rocking the V-neck and the button-down shirt and the feathered hair again. So I don't know what that's about. And it's kind of some kind of midlife crisis, probably. So first I want to talk about what my partner and Scott Parker and I did when we first started working together. So the first project is called Pixels Software. When my partner, former partner Scott Parker and I got together, he was using an animation software, a NURBS-based software that was called Pixels. It's kind of similar to Maya, I guess. And Scott actually, they were a local company in San Diego, and Scott actually kind of had a relationship with one of the founders of the company. They were kind of started out as kind of emailing, talking about the software, and one thing led to another. And when we came together as partners, he's like, look, this guy might want us to do something. So I've talked to him about possibly doing a project for him. And so what we agreed is that we would do this kind of what they call the Customer Orientation Center. And so we started using their NURBS or spline-based software and throwing primitives through lattices like everyone was doing around this time. So this is a lattice, and then this is a cone kind of passing through and time stop frame animation. But the thing that we did that no one was doing is that at the time everyone was kind of wondering, or everyone was kind of freezing or selecting a moment and pulling it out. And what we did is kind of collapse all the moments together into a single moment, which is a really stupid thing to do because basically you get no space. You get this kind of dense, kind of knotty, cancerous mass. But that's what was interesting to us. So, and these first few projects I'm going to go through really quickly. It's kind of a setup for a set of interests, basically. But so this project, this Customer Orientation Center, we worked on for a really long time, mostly trying to figure out how we would actually build this dense, knotty mass. And so we went through many, many iterations, many, many models, and eventually, like happened for a lot at the time, we kind of began this kind of Cartesian description of slicing, and then we were actually suspending these ribbons inside a steel frame, which was the lattice. And so, which seemed cool at the time. The problem is that when they said a Customer Orientation Center, they were actually looking for a space where they could go and project and have clients and do that stuff. And what we gave them is this kind of thing that was barely occupiable, that took up about 30% of their office space. But our argument was like, hey, it's the manifestation of the software. Like, you go and see this thing, and it is your software. It's a full physical demonstration. And they fired us. And so that was the end of that. But one of the things that we did in that process is that at the time we were using also a really old software called Form Z, which would just kind of naturally unfold things. Even if it was doubly curved, it would actually polygonize it and unfold it. And so we were making these drawings trying to figure out how to build the thing, And the drawings were absolutely no help at all. There's no rhino nest or any of that stuff that we have now. But I always felt like this drawing was the wrong answer for a different question, kind of in the words of Bruce Mouse. So. Another project that many SciArc people did was a competition for a San Jose Art Museum at San Jose State. Many SciArc faculty did this competition at the same time. And I'll show it really quickly just to kind of highlight something that we were interested in at the time. So, first of all, in the true fashion of constantly sabotaging your own career, there was a very strict height limit for the competition entry, but we felt compelled to exceed the height limit for various reasons that I won't go into, some of which might have been hubris, I'm not sure, but we actually did something that was way over the height limit, created a kind of a slab tower and a kind of blanket in a courtyard. But so part of the competition entry was this series of kind of comparisons with our project being here and comparing height and girth. But the drawing I want to talk about is this drawing on the bottom, which was our exploration of various kind of formal and organizational systems, and the idea that we weren't at the time interested in making everything smooth and continuous and making everything turn into every other thing. We were actually interested in various systems working in concert and different things doing different jobs, basically. And so the kind of structural organizational grid, a series of tubes to hold galleries and theaters, a kind of skin to capture the core space, and what we called a kind of crystal to create an interstitial space, and then what we called the blanket to create another interstitial space, but also make for a kind of performative element. So we got an honorable mention, which is basically the jury's way of saying, like, interesting idea, but there's no freaking way that we would ever do that, which is ironic because they didn't actually end up building anything anyway. The winner actually didn't go on to build it, but... So, I guess this was right about the time that that Scott and I parted ways, and we kind of went out. I went out on my own, and so, like so many people in this moment, I started to get work in China, and I actually got that work through a big landscape and urban design firm called SWA. They hired me as kind of an architectural design consultant, and so. The very first project that we worked on, or that I worked on, I say we because there are always collaborators in the office, regardless of whether or not you have a partner. But there was a decommissioned cement plant in the district of Qingpu, outside of Shanghai, and they asked us to do a study to look at possible reprogramming and a kind of architectural proposal for the cement plant. Which was, I want to say about a couple 100,000 square feet. And it looks something like that. So when the client tells you that you have 200,000 square feet to work with, we felt like it was a good idea to go ahead and make a proposal for 1.2 million square feet and actually make a proposal for the entire island, which actually SWA was incredibly receptive to, and so we actually created a new simple zoning plan where we zoned one half of let's say third of the island for cultural use, and then this kind of band for housing with a major vehicular spine moving through, pedestrian connections, and then a major pedestrian connection. At the same time, we were actually looking at different ways of dealing with the cement plant itself. So in one instance, we would be leaving the cement plant intact, like a kind of post-industrial relic, and adding program. Another, we'd be inserting program inside. Another, kind of wrapping it and negotiating between the two. In one, it would be demoed with all new program, and the other would be a big roof plan, so or a big encompassing roof like Shumi's at Frenois. So this was actually the result. And it's interesting, while so many of my peers are people, in the profession, we're getting stuff built so rapidly in China. Our proposals for China somehow managed to be, never get realized. So we had the golden touch on this stuff. So just a little bit down the way, in Qingpu as well, we were actually commissioned to look at a park and a series of pavilions within the park. And at this point, we were actually really interested in the idea of the park as this kind of deformation field. And there was a pagoda in the park that was a kind of point of interest throughout. And so we did this series of pavilions or tea houses, which were actually in reference to the pagoda and in reference to this kind of deformation field that we had created based on those relationships. We actually made it to DD on these things, and so we have, so we actually worked with Arup on the kind of curvilinear screen structures to form a kind of bent steel pipe system with teak cladding, and then we have pages and had in the DD set pages and pages of these kind of drawings with these describing the curved rib relationships along with Excel spreadsheets describing all the relationships. But again, as happened with some of the work in China, it just seemed to fall into a black hole and nothing ever kind of came of it. This was my installation in the gallery at SciArc, and I think for me this is a really key or a really important project in the kind of trajectory of my career. It's a little bit, it's a blessing. It was an amazing opportunity. It's also, it makes me feel like a one-hit wonder. It's the one thing that everyone can agree on. They say, like, I loved your installation. Everybody says, I love, more than anything, I love your installation, which should be a compliment, but I'm so insecure, I always feel like what they're really saying is everything else you've done is total shit. But not, not that I don't want to be complimented, because I do and I appreciate it, but let's keep going. So, at the time when we did the installation, this one I collaborated with my former partner, even though we had kind of separated, but I was really interested in this idea of ubiquity and the everyday and the beauty of the everyday and the fact that there are opportunities, I think, in architecture that surround us that are continually overlooked. And one of those I always felt was this kind of Mad Men moment, this kind of 1960s drop ceiling, which is absolutely ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And so I thought that we could actually use the drop ceiling as a framework for exploring patterns and exploring a kind of condition of a surface. And also at the time, I knew that we were really interested in modifying the space of the gallery in a really kind of fundamental way, changing its proportion, changing the spatial configuration. So at the time, and I think probably forever, this composer, avant-garde composer John Cage is always an inspiration to me. This is John Cage preparing one of his prepared pianos, which if you don't know who John Cage is, you really should do. I think that he's an incredibly important figure in the arts and also an important figure for anyone engaged in the production or in a creative pursuit of any kind, in my opinion. But one of the many things, but one of the things that Cage was interested in that Scott and I were fascinated by was this idea of indeterminacy and the idea that you might be able to produce a work that would be different every time that it was experienced, in a way different according to a set of parameters that were established to produce difference, in a way maybe even just for the sake of difference. And so definitely for this installation and for other things we worked on, Cage is kind of an inspiration. So I show this because this is the power of a partner. So on the right-hand side is the installation that we actually did, or a version of it, a kind of rendered version of it. On the left-hand side is the installation that I wanted to do. And it looks like a cartoon because it is a cartoon in a way, but one of the things when you have a partner is that you argue about stuff. And I think actually it's actually a really incredibly productive thing. And so once I bullied him into agreeing that we would do the drop ceiling thing, then I went on to trying to bully him into agreeing that every single element that we plugged in, which would be 121 elements, would be absolutely different. And that everyone would be, curvy and gloopy and, like the tentacles of an octopus or whatever it is that other thing looks like. And he was really insistent that we not do that. And his rationale was compelling, obviously. He said that he was interested in kind of doing more with less, obviously, but also in being able to register the patterns and explore that by using a single identical unit and see what that might mean. And so that turned out to be, I think, incredibly productive, and I think turned out to be one of the reasons why the piece, I think, is successful and I think powerful. But I'm still going to do the other one at some point soon. So we created what we called space scores, and so there's a kind of double binary set of options for each particular unit or cell, meaning it could be set in one position or mirrored, or it could be flipped upside down and mirrored from that, and then we also drop them onto the floor as part of it. And so we used a set of operations to create a set of kind of space scores. The thing was up for 9 weeks, which it was in the summer, and I think that's a bit longer than they actually stay up, but we actually went in and manually changed the exhibit every week for 9 weeks. So if you came at a different time, you would see a wholly different thing. That's just a kind of a annotation of the space score, unit by unit. And then those are the results over the 9 times. So one of the things that I think was amazing about this project is that we did everything here. And so we made a couple bucks or molds for vacuum forming, and we vacuumed all 121 parts here at SciArc. We did some R&D with a company that actually that are specialists or professionals, and they kind of they did 3 or 4 and showed us the tricks, which was really helpful. And then we pulled all 121 parts here. We may have pulled 150 parts to get 121, but we got our 121 parts. And that old, I don't know how it's working still, but that old dinosaur of a vacuum form machine was absolutely perfect. It was brilliant. And this part I'm really in love with, and I'll talk about it a little bit more as I get on into the talk, but you can see these things kind of populating the studios. The students are all, in this case, doing post-production on the units. And then the process of installing them, and so now that's the drop ceiling grid with just a couple of units in. And this is by far, in a way, although it's just a process kind of snapshot, it's personally my favorite photograph of the installation. I mean, for one, I think that the kind of rose-colored paper on the floor and the way the lighting's coming in, but also, I gotta say, that little bastard, Scott, when I saw the things all oriented in exactly the same direction, all identical, I knew, in that moment, I knew what we had done was good. And I have to say, I'm not trying to brag or be full of hubris. Sometimes you do things and they get out there in the world and you know that they're not good, and that happens. But this moment, when it all came together, then I knew that we had something. So that's the opening night. We worked with a lighting designer who's sadly no longer with us, named Peter Noble, and he had a brilliant idea, which is very simple, which is just that for all 121, each unit would have its own light, which made for some really dramatic results, but also gives the piece a kind of texture from above that's different from that from below. So that's just to give a kind of idea, that's kind of late afternoon sun versus this, which is the night of the exhibit, which is partly sunlit, but mostly kind of artificially lit. These are my kids. That's William on the left and Hank on the right. Now, I want to say that all my students and my peers out there, you all know that I'm not one of those guys to ever show you pictures of my kid on the phone. Like, I'll never do it. I guarantee I've never shown any of these guys pictures of my kids. But give me a room with 100 people, I'll show pictures of my kids every single time. Because you're all stuck there. You have no other choice but to sit there and look at pictures of my kid, and I love it. So, and just to take this a little further, this is Will, the one who tipped his hat to the lovely young Maeve, and this is Hank. And I have to say, Will is 9 now, and Miles, the third one, is missing because he's not born yet. But Will is 9 now, and Hank is 7. And I think Hank is still as perplexed and frightened by Will every day as he is in that photograph. This is just absolutely perfect depiction of their personalities. That Will frightens me too, though. So this is a competition that we all, many of us did here, faculty at SciArc. It was an invited competition for the Schindler House at the Mack Center at the Schindler House. The competition was called Vertical Garden, and the premise of the competition is a little bit wacky, in my opinion, but the idea was that the context around the Schindler House was being built up so much that it was becoming threatening and offensive to the house itself, which I don't know. Well, anyway, we can have a really long discussion about what Schindler may or may not have said about something like that, but nonetheless, we had an opportunity to design something in response to that ever-changing or growing context, and so we did. I can't remember. John actually won the competition. I can't remember. There were maybe 9 or 10 people who were invited. Does that sound right? Maybe more? So I'm not showing photographs of the Schindler House or the plans because everyone sitting in this room should know it by heart. And if you don't, you should go get in your car right now. You should drive to the Schindler House like we're telling our third-year students, and just go and experience it. I mean, I think for me, the Schindler House is very personally kind of tied to my history and my evolution as an architect. I went to undergraduate school at Cal Poly Pomona, and so the Schindler House is one of the first places that you visit as a student of architecture. And the other place that you visit, for sure, because it's owned by Cal Poly, is the Neutra House, a VDL house. And so, and later on in my career as a young architect and instructor, I was the resident director of the Neutra House in Silver Lake. And so, for me, the idea of working at the Schindler House was incredibly amazing opportunity, but also incredibly personal in a way to think about those relationships, and also to think about these two characters right here, right? This is Richard Neutra with his hair slicked back and his necktie on, ever the kind of the dapper marketer, and Schindler with his collar open and his hair wildly flying about, ever the political hippie. And so anyway, I have another lecture where I talk about the relationship of these two guys and what their work means for my work, but I won't talk about that today, but I wanted to show this image. So the first thing that we did is look at the kind of flow of circulation within the Schindler House itself, and to really question that, and also question the position of the Mack within it. And so I'm skipping a lot of the in-between stuff, but we came around to the idea that it would make sense to kind of rework the circulation of the house and actually change the location of the Mack, what we called giving Mack the knife, and actually add program, a little amphitheater in the back, and then pushing the bookstore below. So this is a kind of diagram of that, the kind of reconfiguration of the program. And then the other thing that we did is that we did this simple kind of building height relationship analysis and also view plane analysis, and then we used it, for better or worse, to kind of build up this surface that became this kind of crusty protective shell around the existing house. So at the same time, we actually did some analysis of the landscape, of the garden plan, and I was really interested in sort of in sort of working that and mining it for possible patterns, obviously. And so at the time we were using Voronoi script, which we never actually used, again, for a number of reasons, but I think it was an interesting experiment. And then we started to explore what that pattern might actually mean in relationship to a kind of a new kind of lightweight structural shell. I have to say, at the time, we were sort of conceptualizing this kind of lightweight space frame, and we had a number of kind of vertices coming together that at the time was impossible. But now, thanks to Alexis, I actually think that I could build this thing with Alexis's robot joint. So this is a kind of cutaway section with showing the kind of way that we explored the possibility of the lower level and this kind of crusty shell that was encapsulating the house. I guess and this is just as far as we got, but we did a kind of slope analysis to decide whether the shell would be pathway or whether it would be garden or whether it would be skylight. But it's not, obviously this is not a super respectful treatment of the existing house. So the next thing I want to talk about is a series of residential projects that were happening in the office in much more kind of recent timeline. The first is a house in Dana Point, which is actually a commission that we also got through SWA. So I don't know if you can see the location of the site. I have to say that that's the site there. Although this series of residential work, I definitely have some complaints about the way some things went, but in all of the cases of the projects that I'll show, the site is never one of them. Like, we definitely have got to work on some pretty spectacular sites. So this project's interesting in that it was an existing one-story residence, but once you get up to the second level, then you actually have kind of sweeping ocean views, actually in both directions because of the shape of the landform in Dana Point, or because of the point. So this was the existing house, a kind of quaint ranch-style 1950s, and the client also had 3 children. The house was just too small, and so they came with really a super pragmatic set of concerns, as clients always do, and very limited budget, as often happens, which I'm not saying to make excuses, just explaining the reality of the project. So I always like to show the plans first, and it's really, the reason for that is really simple. I'm a plan lover, and everyone who's ever had me as an instructor knows that I am. And so for me, a plan is a really powerful way to figure out organizational relationships and to think through spatial conditions. Not that we don't work everything simultaneously, but the plans are always really important. So in this particular house, we reconfigured, this was the footprint of the existing ground floor. We kind of opened everything up and reconfigured it all, making it more kind of open and loft-like. And then upstairs, we actually created 2 bedrooms for the girls and then a master bedroom suite, and then kind of opened up the whole thing to create this kind of tube so the space kind of pushes through, so opening up the center and the top. So this was the proposal. It's really a very simple kind of modernist proposal, which in and of itself was actually a really tough sell, but we got there. And then this was the kind of renderings for the interior and the exterior. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. Okay, so this is something that I've talked about before, but I'm sure any architect or anyone in architecture school has had the experience that you tell someone that you're an architect or that you're in architecture school, and the uninitiated, their response is always like, "Oh, really? When are you going to design your dream house?" And in their mind, I don't know what they picture when they ask that question, but it's clearly not what you're picturing or what your reality is. And so my wife and I actually purchased a piece of property in Mount Washington in 2005 to build a house on. And it's no dream house, let me tell you. It's a reality house. It's a 2-to-1 slope. It's a substandard lot. It's only about 4,000 square feet. And it's a difficult site, and it's in kind of a crappy neighborhood, to tell you the truth, because that's what we could afford. So it wasn't our dream house by any stretch of the imagination. But the location of the site is roughly here, at the end of a cul-de-sac, which is good. So that gives you actually the picture doesn't even really do it justice, but the site is kind of 2-to-1 and then drops off precipitously at the bottom as well. So I told you I would do it, and now I'm doing it again. So in addition to the site, a big kind of driver for the program was these three guys here. And they look all doe-eyed and innocent right now, and they look sweet as hell. And let me tell you, you need space for these suckers to be outside because they will wreck shit. Seriously. And so this is a driver. When you have a 2-to-1 slope and you have a maximum buildable area of about 1,600 square feet, other than rappelling down the hillside, you have to figure out how you're going to make some outdoor space. And so that's kind of a driver for the project as well. The scheme actually did several iterations or kind of versions of it. And this was not the one that we actually went on to develop for zoning reasons, actually. But this is the one that I think is the best scheme. And I'm showing it in part because I was hoping that Alexis would be here. And I remember he and I were working on a project for Spot on Schools in Italy, and he came to the office one day, and I had a foam model of this particular proposal. And consequently, he would always ask me, like, "Man, when are you going to build that thing? Like, I love that big floating bar. Like, when are you going to do that shit?" The answer turns out to be probably never. But anyway, so I wanted to show this. But I think it's actually the better of the 3 or 4 schemes that we did. But you're entering on the upslope and the garage level, which is here, and you kind of enter under the garage and into the main space. So the public space is this long, thin bar, which is only 16 feet wide, which holds the kitchen and the kind of living space, and actually sits on top of a more kind of rectangular chunk, which holds all the bedrooms and forms a kind of roof deck. So that's the kind of rendered version of that scheme. Not the site's not quite that steep that it looks like you're flying in an airplane, but it looks cool in the portfolio. So these projects were all happening at the same time. So this is another residential project for a couple. What does it say, 2,500 square feet in Escondido, California. So let's see. You can spot the architect house here. So that's the actual project. This one actually did get built, although pretty severely compromised. But part of the reason I show the aerial is just to give an idea of what we were up against. There's a kind of ocean of these faux mission-style homes. I mean, as far as the eye can see. And we were actually in architectural review board controlled neighborhood, meaning that the neighbors have to approve the work that you do. And suffice to say, they want you to do all the things that are already in the neighborhood. And so we got rejected a lot. Like many times we went through the process and were rejected. And so, but eventually we came around to something that would work. But let me go to the plan here. So the plan is really a very kind of modernist or case study plan. You have a kind of garage and the entry, the living space, and then this kind of wing of more private spaces. It gets more private as you go back. But the whole thing is kind of penetrated by this deep courtyard space and a kind of glass bridge. And it all falls under a single big kind of shed-style roof. Really simple. When I know a lot of people talk about low budgets, this is like $220 a square foot. I mean, it's absolutely kind of bare bones. So this is the version of the project that we, the version of the project that finally got approved by the Architectural Review Board. But just a note to you students out there, when we presented the project in this way, it was absolutely rejected. And then we did that, and it was unanimously approved. And I don't know if you can tell, but it's the same project. So, but as you'll see later, this doesn't always work. But so we got it approved, and the house actually did get built, which was good. But all the kind of exterior screens and material changes and all those things that we absolutely drew the shit out of were cut from the project, unfortunately. But with that said, it's a really, the shell and spaces are really good, and the clients are incredibly happy. So. Just some details. This is another, obviously, residential project. This is a different animal altogether. This is actually, we got a commission to do, basically to act as a restoration architect, in part because of my experience at the Neutra House for a Lloyd Wright house in Palos Verdes. I think there are 4 Lloyd Wright houses in Palos Verdes, and one of them is, I think, threatened or actually may have been torn down. But nonetheless, this guy, he took out his sword and shield and went to battle. I mean, the rules and regulations for building in Palos Verdes have been established since the turn of the last century, and he got really adventurous stuff built, and so it's really incredibly inspirational. So we were hired to work on the project, but this guy's eyes are on you the whole time, right? So you've got the eyes of the master watching over your work. So we did 2 things at the house. One is that we helped the client, obviously, and the contractors to do a full restoration and kind of bring it back to its original glory, which really requires a kind of separation of ego and kind of requires that you leave the place without putting your fingerprints on it. But at the same time, the landscape was in complete disarray and disrepair. And so at the time in my office, I had someone working for me who had a degree in landscape architecture. And so I thought, well, screw it, we could do it. And so we became landscape architects, actually, and did a whole new landscape plan that got implemented for the house. And so that was actually really interesting and really exciting to try and bring back the vision of the house in relationship to the landscape back to Lloyd Wright's vision, but also to explore some of our own ideas. And it's an interesting opportunity for gratification. Actually working on landscape projects is really interesting. So that's the kind of result. So the kind of restoration of the original house, and then the kind of new cushion of greenery. And one of the things that we did was to, in addition to redesigning all the landscape, was to create this kind of decomposed granite and core tin pathway that actually loops all the way around the site, so you can actually experience the whole site, which you couldn't do before. But so I guess this is, it's an amazing, absolutely incredible house. And one of the things that we wanted to do is bring it back to this original vision, which wasn't the case when we started, of the house kind of floating on this cushion of landscape and appearing to kind of hover. It's actually set into piles in the mound, but you can see you get the kind of twinkling lights of Redondo Beach beyond. You actually learn a lot when you work on a project like this in terms of, obviously fits and finishes, but also the kind of the geometry and the siding, and it's a really incredible project. So the next project is for the same client. When they just couldn't bear anymore the 180-degree views of the ocean, and they had to get away from it all. They actually go to Ojai, California. And so they actually own a property in Ojai as well as the property in Palos Verdes. And they asked us to look at their existing kind of getaway property in Ojai, which is here. So again, another spectacular site. I mean, I think that the original zoning plan was have the thing broken up in like 20-acre parcels or something like that. And this project is like a half an acre, because it was actually broken up prior to the ordinance. But what it affords is that when you're here, you have these amazing views of all these orchards and the entire valley beyond, which kind of runs east-west. And you really feel like the property is kind of limitless in a way, which is pretty amazing. That's not my design, believe it or not. So that was the existing house, or it's probably still is the existing house, but, and it's what I kind of came to call the Postmodern Misfit. The house was done in the 80s and has all the kind of trappings of the postmodern style, but which is neither here nor there in a way. The main problem with it is that it actually doesn't take advantage of the views or take advantage of the of the landscape or the climate or any of the things that the site affords. And so it really is a kind of misfit in the site. So at the time, we were looking at different geometric constructs and minimal surface, in a way not for this particular project, not as a model for modeling the house specifically, but as a kind of way of thinking about the space. And so we were looking at cross troughs, and we kind of made up this thing that we called the double cross trough, which allows for kind of penetration up and down, kind of directional, and side to side directional. And it became a kind of model for a way of thinking about the spatial connections of the house. So we just blew up, or in the design, we just blew up the Postmodern Misfit. We kept the infrastructure on the base, which was actually retained and kind of set into the hill, and then redesigned the upper part entirely to kind of work within the framework of that. One of the things that we did, in addition to doing the whole upstairs thing, was to actually move the garage and kind of tuck it under the house to get more of the kind of landscape. But so basic diagrams kind of showing the way that the new scheme would work in terms of the programmatic breakdown. And so we would have private spaces on this side of the upper floor and public spaces on this side of the upper floor, with still private in the bedrooms below. So kind of natural ventilation, circulation, and then back to the plan. So base level plan, and then the upper level with the kind of the spaces breaking down the way that I was describing. So in addition to the house and the site, they actually commissioned us to design a detached office across this kind of ravine, and also a small guest house. The small projects were really exciting, and we actually moved into DD onto the two small pavilions. That's as far as it got, unfortunately, but it's rendering, the obligatory night rendering. And then I think this is the last residential project that I'll show. And again, all these things were kind of happening at the same time. So through SWA again, we were hired to look at a development in Krasnodar, which is in southern Russia. And the idea of the development was that the developer wanted to create a kind of resort community, but also they wanted to bring golf to Russia, which I don't know if that's a good idea or not. They actually don't have golf in Russia, or they didn't at the time, so they wanted to create a big golf course with a ton of residences around it, which would be kind of vacation getaways, but would, the developer hoped, at some point turn into kind of permanent homes for residents. And so that's a site. Again, no complaints about the site whatsoever. So that's a photograph within the site from the visit that we made to Krasnodar. And you can get an idea of the kind of level of greenery and the way that the bodies of water work within the site. It's admittedly a bit marshy, but makes for really interesting relationships. So one of the things that we did was to start right away showing the client images of architecture that we think is exciting and that we thought might be appropriate. So on the left-hand side is a picture of the site, and on the right-hand side is a picture of a John Lautner house. And I should have known right away something was going to go awry, because the client's response to this, and I have to say, SWA hired us, but we were working for the developer, so we got design feedback from the developer. And the developers, all of them, young guys, would always say, "We love it, but people won't like it." I don't know which people that they know, or I don't know. Maybe I just don't know people, which is entirely possible. But that was always their response. Like, we love it. Like, if you want to do something for me, that would be amazing, but people won't like it, and we have to sell this shit. And do you get it, that we have to sell it and that people have to like it? And I would never respond. So one of the things that absolutely fascinated me about the project is the idea of the dacha, or the kind of Russian getaway house. Now, it's interesting, it's not a vacation house per se, but in communist era Russia, there were kind of loopholes for these smaller residential structures. And so almost everyone would have a house in the country that they would build, and they would be kind of ramshackle, makeshift, often dilapidated, but they would be informal and have an amazing relationship to the landscape. And also, the people would grow fruits and vegetables and help to kind of offset or alleviate the realities of food rationing by making their own kind of private kind of agricultural zone. So I was really fascinated by the history of this type, let's say, and the client was absolutely not. So the clients were all in their 30s, and they were very much insistent on a kind of new Russia, and to them this was old Russia. It was like what their parents did, and so they weren't interested in it at all, which didn't stop me. So this is the other thing that we were up against. This is the reality of a construction crew in Krasnodar. I'm not lying. So the client was very savvy about this. The client was like, whatever we do, these assholes are not building our project. To which I responded, that's really smart. And so, but beyond just the nature of the crew is the nature of the construction, right? So it's masonry, very poorly done, entirely masonry, and they were creating these dense, heavy structures with very minimal openings in a climate that's not so dissimilar from ours. So it's actually a very wonderful climate that they have. They're not very far actually from the Black Sea. It's in the southern part of Russia. And so to me, it's a weird evolution of a type where the kind of construction technology trumps, in a way, the reality, let's say the ecological realities of the place. So the client asked us to look at prefab, which, you know, I have to say that it made me cringe a little bit, but definitely a lot less than that. So, but the thing about prefab is that when you say prefab, it's hard to know what someone means when they even use those words, right? So the first thing that I did was to set about educating the client about what prefab actually is, and so we talked about a kind of system, a kit of parts approach versus a kind of unit or module approach, and then the possible results, and also the kind of material and tectonic realities of the different systems. So the client was really excited that we engaged the Empyrean and actually used the company, the kind of kit of parts company that had done the dwell home, which was, I have to say, Empyrean was incredibly supportive and really great to work with, and they really are excited about partnering with architects, but I really knew that we didn't want to do the next dwell home. So, but that's okay. I mean, what we did is set about kind of educating ourselves on the system, the absolute requirements of the Empyrean system. It's really simple. It's a simple post and beam system with kind of panelized or unitized and panelized infill. And then they have these really strict criteria about what you can do with the roof. And so, I mean, obviously the first thing that we went for was to explore the possibility of working with variability in the roof pitch and maybe creating something that had more of a profile of a kind of continuous ribbon, which Empyrean was absolutely thrilled about, and they were basically said, absolutely, it works with our system, and all systems go. So we showed these things to the client, and they didn't like them. Well, they did, but they said people wouldn't like them. So, so we were kind of struggling. And so I thought back to my experience with the Garrison residents, and I thought, well, maybe if I show them something a bit friendlier, they'll like it. And so we started to show them these things which I would never show my peers, but here I am showing my peers. But so we showed them these things which were a bit friendlier and kind of populated with people and trees and those things. But the design obviously is not changing at all. And then the client kept sending me images like this. Now, the Robie House is an absolutely amazing project. It's fantastic. Unfortunately, they kept sending me images of this and also really bad knockoffs of Frank Lloyd Wright projects as well. But the problem is that I was trying to convince them just to get to the middle of the last century, and they're trying to put the project back to the turn of the last century. And so we just couldn't come to terms. And so they kept sending me emails like this, and then eventually I wrote an email which was basically that. And so that was all done. But little did I know that everything was also going to stop all at the same time. So I did that, and then we got that. So let's take a survey. And so we had these 6 projects all going at the same time, and among many other things actually of different scales, but this was the kind of core of the work. So this project actually got built, but the funding was cut during construction, so they built the shell, but all the kind of screens and finishes and things never made it into the project, or at least not yet. My project, we're actually unable to procure a loan for, so that project is kind of on permanent hold, although I still have a piece of property in Mount Washington, which I'd be happy to show you if you're interested in buying something. This project got built, obviously, but was really severely compromised. But it is what it is. These are all kind of learning experiences. This one was abandoned completely. They're actually selling the property, and that one we just plain got fired. So the kind of preservation project is the one that had a full budget and remained intact, but no real kind of design fingerprint there. So, so then that's it. So everything stopped. And in the media, I don't know if you remember, everyone was talking about all the companies that were too big to fail. And so it's funny how a set of words kind of takes hold, and you don't really know what it means. And so I thought, I wonder what that list looks like. It's really big. There's like 35 pages of companies that were these are just the companies that got money, right? I won't show you them all. And then I thought, well, what kind of companies are exactly the right size to fail? And I had at least one answer right at the top of my head. And so I started to think about smallness in a way at first in a kind of silly way, as a kind of direct opposite of what they were talking about in the media. But obviously, when you run a business, there are financial realities, and getting small on the business side is easy. It's just math. I mean, it can be emotional, but you just have to make sure that you don't have more going out than you have coming in. It's simple. But what I thought was more interesting was maybe to take an opportunity to think about the work, and to think about my own interests, and to think about things that aren't driven by clients or all those other things. That work's important, and I'm an architect who wants to build. That's why I do what I do, and so I'm not saying that I wanted to avoid that work, but it gave me an opportunity to think about what does it mean to do something small, or what can smallness be about? And so I couldn't help but return back to my experience here doing the installation, obviously, and the kind of gratification of that, like unbelievably tiny budget, unbelievably small timeline, but with a kind of tremendous payoff, much bigger payoff than most of the other projects in terms of gratification. But then the other thing that I started to think about was my experience in New York after my time at Columbia. I worked for an Italian architect named Gaetano Pesce, who's actually an architect and an industrial designer, and I worked actually in his fabrication shop making stuff out of steel and resin, which was an absolutely spectacular experience. And this is a kind of view of the studio, which is really, it has that kind of Calder-esque feeling to it, the kind of cacophony, and you know creative stuff's happening, and it's amazing in that way. It was also treacherous and really smelly and hot as hell, but fantastic. So this is me in the left-hand corner, the human robot. So before we were doing things with robots, we were kind of extruding resin from this kind of industrial machine to make these tables in the shop. That's me again, kind of setting it. And then that's the result. And so it's not that I ever want to make anything that looks like that, because I don't. But the idea that the thing that amazed me about Pesce's work is that it cut absolutely across all scales. So he was making and designing and prototyping everything from, stuff the size of a plate to, to things the scale of a building and everything in between. These are things that I would like to strive for. I think that's my favorite. Again, the materials are so mundane, and the transformation is absolutely complete in a way. So there's a speculation about kind of futures, but there's also a kind of playful reckoning with the present that I find really fascinating. So a series of quick kind of sketch projects in the realm of smallness. How am I doing on time? Am I over? Am I over? It's 10 after? Okay, I'm going to roll. I'm going to rock this out right now. So one of the things I'm working on is what I'm calling a energy gazebo. I'm actually was working on a canopy for a residential exterior space, and I realized that this was a kind of form that you had to reckon with, and I actually absolutely despise gazebos for all the reasons that maybe people despise them, but I felt compelled to work on one. So that, coupled with a current fascination with PV technology, this is called solar ivy. It's something my students actually introduced me to, and it's not commercially available yet, but it's a combination of PV and piezoelectric. So the leaves collect energy from the sun's rays, but also kind of flutter, and the vibration creates energy as well. So we set about to working on that, the type of the gazebo, and kind of analyzing the parts of it to see what that might mean. So a piece for, for collecting water, a bench, and then the skin kind of populated with these kind of solar leaves, and then working on simple patterning routines to explore both the the rationalization of the skin, but also the performativity of it. So the size of the aperture, and then the kind of length and orientation of the leaf. Smaller. This is another small project for, it's called sound field panels, and it's really about kind of dealing with two opposing forces, one being the need to gather light from adjacent space, and the other being the need to actually block the sound. And so these diagrams are about that. I'm sorry, I'm going to go quickly now. So this is our first pass at kind of reconciling the opposing forces, and then an exploration of the kind of panelization or the unitization, and also, again, like way back in San Jose, a combination of two different systems. So one to block the sound, and the other to emit light, and then establishing through Grasshopper a relationship or a kind of paneling routine, and then one thing kind of Booleaning out the other. That's the thing in the space. and then the smallest. So I know this is, you have to forgive this. I know this is the stuff that online tutorials are made of, and I acknowledge that, but I've always wanted to design a vase, and so I've always been in love with the Alvar Aalto vase, actually, obviously, but it actually doesn't work, which is really interesting. The kind of geometry and form is really compelling, but if you've ever used one, it doesn't work terribly well as a vase, actually. And then we wanted to look at the kind of typical, simple bud vase. But the thing that I wanted to do, and then materials, we were looking at porcelain and then direct output resin 3D printing. But what I was really interested in doing is designing a series of smaller vases that could actually aggregate into a larger set of vases. So it could be a big thing via its aggregation. So we started by designing a bud vase. The indentation is about the relationship to the hand and the way you might grip it. So that I'm going from small to big. So this is a kind of longer, taller, thinner one. And then a doubling of that. And then looking at possible configurations or relationships of those things. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I know we're out of time. So Hernan always talks about the Ramones, which I think is fascinating, and he says that Ali Rahim actually once compared him to the Ramones because he does the same thing, he says, over and over again, I think, which is interesting. I think the Ramones are amazing. I think when I think about his work, I think more about Charlie Parker and virtuosity and intensity and innovation and kind of density. And when I think about my work, not to say that I'm comparing myself with a musical icon, but in the realm of if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? I can't help but think about this guy, who, if you don't know from the photograph, is Johnny Cash. And so Johnny Cash, obviously, was a very famous musician, didn't really play the guitar very well, and he didn't really sing very well either. He's kind of a loud talker more than a singer, but he always had a story to tell. And he always had kind of utmost respect and admiration for the next generation coming up and was inspired by them. And so thanks for listening to my stories.